Avatar: The Last Airbender, The Search. It starts off the most highly anticipated arc of the series since its conclusion by showing us just a guy we don't know in a faded flashback trying to recite lines from a play, only to get startled by a mask-wearing woman who happens to be Zuko's mom. It's charming to see her have a fun side after all. She calls him her boyfriend, and he fortunately doesn't take offense to her insult. One of them says that only with her face hidden could they be together. He proposes and is unnecessarily written to reveal that when she was little, she acted like his childhood bully. First May and now him. What is it with this toxic trend? Good thing she doesn't act as bad as this anymore, so now it's fine. But the fact remains, there's better people to date than your childhood bully. How did he begin loving her after she hit him? It's so nice of her to agree to marry him without a ring. It finally shows the present day where a guy says blah blah in front of a council because the writer didn't feel like giving him dialogue, and Sokka lampshades how boring he is. How did he forget that this guy's here to lecture on ancient theories of government? It's nice that the lecture guy is so focused on reciting his lecture that he doesn't seem to care that people are talking during it at full volume. Katara lampshades their misbehavior, and Aang says sorry, and Sokka calls her boring and gets a snowball thrown at himself. Zuko hears the word family and asks the professor to repeat, causing him to amusingly whisper that he's still a teenager after all, which made this kind of funny. He says family is a small country, and a country is a large family, and in treating his own family with dignity, a ruler learns how to govern his nation with dignity. Clearly it's not fair because not everyone's gonna have a family that deserves dignity. Of course there's no dignity in being trapped in a prison or asylum, but it's for the best if Ozai and Azula are kept there. And it's not like he didn't try to be polite to them before that. So this makes Zuko feel bad. Then there's another flashback where Ursa sees her mom sadly say she loves her, and Ursa gets told by the Fire Lord that she has to marry his son Ozai to yield a bloodline of great power. According to the Fire Sages, who conveniently know this. Either because they know what causes people to be capable of being a great bender by nature, or they can see the future, but not enough to know where Aang is. It even mattering who Ozai marries reveals that there is the genetic component to what makes people benders, which makes far more sense than the nonsense that the show is going with that even a pair of twins could potentially have only one of them with magic, with the excuse that the most spiritual people are benders, whatever that even means, which is the reason why all Air Nation people are benders. Meaning that if your surrounding culture is spiritual, you can end up being able to use magic even if you wouldn't have been able to otherwise. But how do you describe villains like Ozai and Azula as spiritual? So this retcon makes actual sense, though it makes the twins impossible. And sadly, there's going to be a comic after this that also has, well, I don't know if they're twins, maybe they're just sisters that happen to be the same height as each other by coincidence. But if they are twins, it makes it even stupider that one's a bender, and that one is the evil one. You'd think only good people would be benders. In the Avatar world, what does spiritual even mean? Because it's not like only people who want to worship the spirits, who I guess are the gods of the Avatar world, are benders. Because we don't see benders constantly worshipping at a shrine for the spirits, let alone worshipping gods. Who can actually be religious in a world like the Avatar world? By the way, why is he having her only have children with one of his sons, considering that Ozai is not first in line for the throne anyways? I assume Iroh is taken, but nothing would stop the Fire Lord from doing what he wants. Even Iroh is saying no. He could still have her have a baby with Iroh first, and then Ozai as a backup plan. He could have her date both of them at once. That'd be the common sense idea. No matter where Iroh is at this point, he could get her to him for a bit eventually. I don't know how anyone noticed that Zuko is more upbeat than usual. He doesn't look happy. Zuko has Azula in front of Ozai and brings her tea, and she bites the plate and she calls him out on expecting her to drink tea in an undignified way because she can't use her arms. Tai chi blocks her, and he says that's unnecessary because she's restrained, even though firebenders can breathe fire. When I saw her bite the plate, at first I thought she was breathing fire. Nothing would stop her from doing that. So I have to assume that the only reason Aang didn't also remove her bending just in case is that he thinks it's a terrible thing to have to do and only did it to Ozai because he's a king, considering how much the removal of bending is demonized in the Legend of Korra. Zuko gets told to leave Azula alone with him. Then the next flashback scene is a complete waste of time. We already figured that Ikem would be mad about his girlfriend being kidnapped. I know the point is to show that he can be brave too, but what's the point of showing that? Instead of him blatantly wasting time trying to order around to the Fire Lord, why doesn't he ask to come with her? Oh, I guess even though Ozai doesn't even love Ursa, he'd still be jealous of her kissing someone else and be too petty to let it go on. Even though literally all he needs her for is breeding stock. He doesn't have to keep her in this castle as a wife. He could have a maid raise the kids as a mother and send her home when he's done with her. And he hated her positive influence on his kids growing up. But he doesn't know he will yet. It's cool to see him throw a flaming fake sword prop. Conveniently, he tells her to tell him that marrying Ozai is what she actually wants to make him go home. So she says she joyfully accepted his proposal to protect him. What did he expect? That it could overcome the will of the Fire Lord? He has a point that she wouldn't belong anymore if she went with him, and therefore neither would he. But if he really loves her, he should have just offered to go with her, lying that he's just her friend. And then Ozai wouldn't know that there's any reason to keep him from her. She even thinks to lie that he's just her friend. So I have to just assume that the reason she didn't have him come along with her is that she thought Ozai would be so petty that if he ever caught them kissing, they'd be severely punished. Even though Ozai doesn't even need to tell people that Ursa's his wife. He could just admit to everyone what he needed her for the good of the royalty, and then get a different woman to kiss. He could get any woman he wanted. Then he wouldn't have to care that she's kissing someone else, because he could kiss his girlfriend too. It's too bad Ikem revealed that he was her boyfriend, and so he wouldn't believe Ursa if she lied about it. This whole conflict only arose because everyone involved didn't think at all. Speaking of that, Zuko somehow insists on escorting Azula home on his own, even though he's told by his bodyguard that the chi blocking's gonna wear off soon. It's normal for Zuko to make stupid decisions because of his ego, thanks to the inferiority complex he grew up with. It was always predictable that she'd find a way to become dangerous even now. He says mercifully that he wants her to stay in the palace in her old room because she'd be more comfortable there. Which I do prefer to the overly dark concept of her being in the nut house, and even says she'll be guarded every minute. It's still too big of a risk for someone he knows wants to be the real Fire Lord. But he wasn't knowledgeable enough to know that right after the chi blocking wears off, she's flexible enough to get her arm out of the straitjacket, and fire lightning that misses to get away from him. She must have always planned on doing a handstand to get his fire to break her chain. How else could she get her legs free? So she finally escapes from him. Then there's a flashback that's got no dialogue to go by faster. Ikem was upset and ran away to live a life alone for a long time and eventually met his spirit. Most people don't run away to live in the woods just because their girlfriend vanished. It should have been explained that he thought the Fire Lord would have him hunted down out of jealousy. Zuko gets a guard to tell him where Azula went and is clever enough to check something for warmth to find out where she went. To the other side of a portrait, it's a secret passageway that leads to one of the many secret chambers. She finds his mom's letters that are the key to finding her. She destroys one out of sadism. Good thing Ozai didn't destroy them out of sadism. She says she'll tell him what was in those letters on one condition. She couldn't have read all of them that fast. She must have already read them as a kid. The fact that she knows about them means it doesn't really matter if the letters still exist or not. She could still tell him about them. Then there's a flashback that exists to explain why Zuko doesn't seem to know any maternal grandparents. Ozai forbid Ursa from having any ties to her past so she can entirely devote herself to her family. So she's not allowed to mention her family or town ever again. It's just him doing this for the evils. There's no logical reason he wouldn't let her parents live with him. That way he could keep her devoted to being a mother anyways. She could have suggested it before this. What would have been more believable is if her parents used to be allowed to live with them, but they were sent home because they had the same positive influence on Zuko of being good people, which she already hated with Ursa. So it could still be explained away without this. And it doesn't matter that it was written wrong instead because it's just one minor scene. Aang thanks Zuko for inviting him to his home because they've been out of touch for a week. Meanwhile, they didn't mind going a year without talking to Toph because she's not polite. Toph had to stay at the academy because now that people have seen her metal benders in action, everybody wants to be a metal bender, including the police. Zuko tells his friends he's going to look for his mother in her hometown and leave Iroh to the throne in the meantime. Somehow Aang and Katara are dumb enough to wonder why he's asking his best friends to join him. It's really to protect them from Azula, but because they're his friends was a good enough excuse. Azula goes out from behind the curtain, which I have to assume is specifically to scare his friends into trying to knock her out, because there's no reason for her to do that other than sadism. Suki and Sokka hug, and it's explained that Azula is going with them unrestrained. And his friends lampshade how dangerous that is. Iroh wants Zuko to get peace for himself and wants that for Azula too. Too bad she'll always be evil, so sympathizing with her and trying to make us do that is pointless. And Zuko says they'll need to take turns keeping an eye on Azula. Sokka makes a mistake for no reason of threatening her with the boomerang, so she zaps him, which eventually gets him to act humble. Iroh relatably calls his new castle dreary and can't believe he used to want to rule it, and is asked by someone what she could do to make him feel better. He declares it's National Tea Appreciation Day, which is good for a lot of people, and gives someone tea that sadly I don't get to see if he turned out to enjoy. Aang says it's even better than old times because now he can kiss Katara, and she finds it sweet and lets him. I don't know why Azula doesn't specify who she's talking about when she asks them her paranoid question. I just have to assume she thinks Ursa got the team to fight her. I don't blame her. Zuko says he doesn't want to go to the town in the middle of the night like bandits. Aang starts glaring because he can feel a spirit in his face, and Sokka jokes around. I know this is a reference to the fact that the spirit will appear later in the story, but it's completely pointless padding to write that. Aang sees the spirit, and Azula plans on leaving without them. Zuko thinks she's too high up, even though firebenders can fly, and I never got told that they couldn't fly if they were too high up. So he's just overprotective of her because she's paranoid now, even though being paranoid usually makes you do stuff to get yourself more safe. Aang glides down to catch her, and he should have known she'd burn a hole in it to escape. Azula hears a hallucination of Ursa warn her she's only hurting herself and look as concerned as her real mother would be, because she's a personification of the rational part of her mind trying to reason with her, giving her truth she doesn't want to hear. She accuses her of telling Zuko to lock her up, even though the whole goal of this trip is for Zuko to find her. She says Ursa's afraid of her power, which she would have been. Azula and Surge are a lot alike, and I wish her hallucinations were this sweet. Azula is told she is confused and pulls out a piece of paper that she thinks would let her take the throne, and she plans to kill her to stop her perceived plotting. Her imagination bought Katara the time to freeze her. Zuko wonders if Aang's alright, and everyone around her sees the spirit. Then we see Ursa write a letter to hide, and Zuko tells her he's too scared to sleep because he had a nightmare about Azula. So we get to see her show him affection and tell him to sleep in her bed, and gives the letter to an old lady she trusts. But she's too cowardly to mail it, and instead it turns out Ozai was always telling her to file those who wait for him. What, did she think there would be spies that would see her mail it? All she'd have to do is look around and see that there aren't any spies. It wasn't necessary to establish that she couldn't even mail letters to her loved ones successfully. It's needlessly cruel. I don't know why a writer that's being needlessly cruel gave her Ecum. The coward says the letter reveals a secret about the prince that scares Ozai. Aang eventually talks to the spirit, politely apologizing for disturbing him, but he still wants to fight, so apparently only let him talk because he wanted to hear what he had to say. Eventually Appa attacks the spirit, and eventually sends flying spirits at them. Azula tells Zuko to let her help fight them, because Aang's too scared to fight spirits. Azula is released to save them, and it's lampshaded later that she's still unbound, even though Azula was saving herself, not just them. Eventually, Sokka puts a blanket over Katara and eventually says that he doesn't mind her mistreating him because she's a sister, which causes Zuko to ask for a blanket and thank him for it and give one to Azula. Because of this, he finds a letter from his mom that insists that Zuko isn't Ozai's son, but the sequel show establishes that he keeps being in the royalty anyways. It's always a waste of time to see Azula hallucinate because she'll never listen to her advice that she'd get a better life if she stopped acting scary. Nothing but predictable stuff happens after this, and it'd be boring to talk about every panel when there's nothing to say. Eventually we see Azula burn a flower for not being as pretty as the others, and her mother scolds her and tells her to go to her room, even though nothing would make her do that because Ozai isn't on her side. She asks Zuko if he was alright, causing Ozai to be resentful of her influence, and he decides to go to an archer of Bratsam and hire him to kill Ikkum, because sadism. Eventually Zuko has to deal with Azula, and he eventually grabs her. She wonders why he didn't burn the letter. The fires get put out, and eventually, we see Azula explain that one of her teachers was impossibly stupid, and Zuko's told to shut up for acting like Azula was wrong when she's the better bender, which he'd know. Zuko's given an abusive rant that explains why he said something in the show, and we get to see his mother tell Ozai off for it. Ozai gets told Ikkum couldn't be found for months because he went to a dangerous forest. Ozai's only motivated by sadism, so he punishes them for being unable to do what he wants, even though there was no way anyone could. Eventually Ozai reminds Ursa that she isn't allowed to make contact with anyone from her past, which makes it completely pointless to include a scene where he first explained that to her. And she says she knew that he was intercepting his letters. He lets her think that he got rid of Ikkum. Then we see Zuko disguise himself, which is smart. Aang should have known he needed a hat to have a proper disguise. Why didn't they bring a wig? They eventually find out the town's putting on the play from the start of the arc. It's sweet to see Zuko remind Azula of their childhood fun together and her happily join in. And realistically they're told to stay quiet. Zuko asks about Ursa and they get startled by someone, and they eventually meet the director who's inexplicably wearing a mask like he was in the play. He eventually invites them all to his house for info on her, and Zuko thanks him, and Katara compliments the director's home in front of his wife. Zuko sweetly agrees to see the doll of a little girl called Ki. She's shown as capable of failure instead of a Mary Sue right away because she failed to give her doll a good new haircut, which reminds Zuko of his sister, who tries to intimidate her for fun because she's just like Ozai. The man kisses his wife on the cheek, and reveals that Sokka was smart enough to say that the group's a bunch of drama historians. The director gives the heroes a bunch of exposition that's boring because we were already told it in a better way. It's revealed that Ikkum ran off to a valley where people go to forget their lives, because it's a world full of spirits. And Ki's mom says Ursa went to the same place. Zuko thanks him, and Ki hopes she'll see him again. Azula thinks the happiness of that family must have been fake because she's paranoid and her parents hated each other. Aang apologizes to Zuko, and doesn't want Zuko to find Ikkum and hopes he was lost to history. Zuko says Azula took back the letter. He cares more about finding out who he really is than leading his country. Ursa in a flashback hears Azula confess to her that Ozai is planning to kill her son. So eventually, to save her son, Ursa tells Ozai she'll give him an untraceable poison she conveniently knows how to make for no reason so that he could get the throne in exchange for Zuko's life. But what's stopping him from killing him anyways? I guess she assumes that if she simply runs off with Zuko without saying this, he'll send people after the two of them to kill them. Because Zulon wouldn't believe him if he just lied to him that Zuko was killed without any sort of proof. Fortunately, it's explained that she knows how to do this because conveniently her mother was an herbalist. And so she conveniently learned from her when most people don't learn from their parents' jobs. So in alternate universes where her mother wasn't an herbalist, things went by very differently. He tells her to give him the poison and then leave the capital city forever because he doesn't trust her not to poison him too, since he thinks everyone's like him. And that's the only reason, because if he had a brain, he'd know that if she was like that, she would have already done it. I mean, it's kind of common sense. I mean, it is the smart thing to do, because he's abusive. Getting rid of Ozai would benefit and protect her kids too. She should have known he wouldn't let her take both children, because he needs heirs. She should have said to him that when they're adults, Zuko will go back to him to be the heir. Because then he wouldn't have a reason to care, because she'd be taking his kids off his hands for him, and they'd still get to be his heirs. She could explain that she'd want Zuko to be the Fire Lord because she thinks he'd be a great one. This could have been resolved if they were smarter. He doesn't think Zuko would lead the country how he would anyways. So wouldn't he realize he'd rather have someone like him in charge than Zuko? So what good damn is he? If he let her leave with Zuko, then he could just say that Zuko died and have an excuse to have Azula be his heir. So we see her kiss her kids and hug Zuko. Eventually the heroes go to Forgetful Valley, and there's a joke because Aang didn't find this out because he's the Avatar. He did it because of a sign. Azula's warned that if she tries blasting her way through, the fire would spread to the whole forest. Eventually Aang assumes he would benefit from following a random animal, which conveniently leads him to the lake. Azula sees her mother in the lake and takes a fit, and her bending causes them to get threatened by flowers that shatter like ice. So Katara figures out there's a waterbender using nature against them, something that already happened in the show. Azula protects Sokka so that she can keep taking advantage of them for protection. Aang frees Zuko from plants pinning him to a tree. Katara takes control of the plants and tells people to show themselves. There's a flashback where Ursa goes up to a kid asking to see some people she knew and gets told they're gone, making it especially pointless that we saw a scene that explained why Zuko doesn't know his grandparents, because we would have been told why here. And yeah, it's needlessly cruel of her to not have her parents around anymore. There's no reason to write that whatsoever. Eventually, the director Norin asks her out. It's explained that the waterbender freaked out at the heroes because she thought a forest animal was disturbing the pool, which has to remain undisturbed like the others in the forest. She explains that her brother here used to borrow people's stuff to prove he could, which makes sure he won't care as much that he got his face disfigured one day. The waterbender went to a library and found out about a convenient spirit that could give people new faces. It makes sense since there was a spirit in the show that could steal faces. I don't know why they ever had a single failed attempt to make it to the Forgetful Valley. The heroes made it here effortlessly. For some reason, the reason her brother hasn't eaten is that ever since his injury, he's caught between life and death, so he doesn't do much of anything now. That's confusing and unnecessary. It turns out the spirit's nearby when face-like patterns appear, because the spirit likes to show off. While that's also confusing and unnecessary, it's interesting enough to be worth it. The woman complains that she always seems to be at the wrong pool when the spirit goes to drink from one of them. But there's only 4 pools. There's no way that she would have never seen the spirit in all of these years. All she'd have to do is stay here long enough. Aang plans to help her, and Azula gets impatient to find her mother instead. She assumes Ursa sent these two to slow her down, freaks out, and Aang astral projects into the spirit world, and his spirit gives him a ride because he's the Avatar, so he sees him as a fellow spirit. Eventually tells the wolf to drink from another pool and accidentally ends up riding it, which offends the owner of the wolf, the mother of faces. Eventually, the fighting between the siblings gets stopped by talking, and Ursa says Norin's name is the same name as the Dragon Emperor's name from her play from the arc's start. He tells her he knows her name already, and almost scares her away. He shares a memory with her that Ikam had too, and she ends up recognizing him. Good for her. The Mother of Faces says she's a nice person and grants 1 favor to a mortal every season. If she was really a nice person, she wouldn't mind being asked for favors a lot, because it doesn't seem like she has anything better to do. Aang asks for 2 favors and she refuses. Kindness, yeah, right. Talk about convoluted drama. If she's nice enough to do a favor for 1 person, she'd do it for 2. Zuko decides to let the waterbender talk to the spirit. Coming to the rescue of the main characters, Azula interrupts her to get information from the spirit. She reveals that Ursa asked her for a new face, and to test her sincerity, she asked her for a plain face. But that's not really a plain face. Why were we shown the flashback where Norin was recognized by Ursa before this point? Azula disappears, and Zuko and Sokka decide to leave, with one saying thanks. The spirit really deserves to be tied up with water here, but she should know better than to annoy her. She could either wait a season for her brother's cure, or do this and potentially guarantee that she'll never help her. Eventually the story shows me Ikem telling Ursa that it's too painful to stay in the prop warehouse because of old memories. So he went to Forgetful Valley and came home as a different person. And the whole reason he ran away was because he missed Ursa, so it sure is convenient that he didn't decide to forget about Ursa. He advised her to get a new face for protection. Ursa thinks that with a new face, she would be able to at least see her kids again. Ikem warns her that only getting to see a glimpse of her kids every so often as they grow up isn't much of a life. She says she can't stop wondering how they're doing and naturally hates it. Aang goes after the spirit, who rants because she thinks it's already offensive that people ask for new faces when she takes the credit for their real ones, rather than science being responsible. She hypocritically accuses Aang of being the selfish one because she's the childish one. It's a great concept, but if she's completely unlikable, that's just begging for fans to insist that she's a disappointing concept and call her an unnecessary part of the long-awaited story. The flashback has Ursa be with Ikem for a while and reveal that she can't even try to bring her kids to her town because she'd be endangering everyone there. He should know that. Azula wouldn't keep quiet. She explains to the spirits that her pain comes from memories. How convenient that the spirit can sense pain, causing her to ask her this question. The spirit could have easily been written to say right away that she could also give her amnesia. This is why Ikem remembered her. He didn't ask her for amnesia as well. Naturally, the spirit who was nice enough to grant her a favor was willing to let her keep her memory of Ikem. Thankfully, she's written to say she's horrible, which lampshades the fact that some people would hate her for getting herself to forget her kids. But she just did something smart. This is the thing that's controversial about the arc. No one expected Zuko's mother to have done this, and it wasn't necessary. But I can understand why it was written. The writer wanted to be nice to Ursa. So as someone who read a lot worse stories, I'm fine with this. Zuko finds out his mother's just fine. He says the shortcut to her house from Misu worked. He tells Sokka to stay outside to keep an eye out for Azula. Norin had a feeling he'd return, and Ki hugs Zuko, calling them best friends already, desperate for a big brother. She invites him to dinner, with him being shy and trying to say no at first. He's impressed that they eat dinner together every night. He asks her if she's happy, she agrees, and he smiles, causing him to say he's bothered them enough. Norin mans up and urges Zuko to tell her the truth because it's the right thing to do. Why didn't he just do this in the first place now that Ozai is not a threat anymore? And everyone thinks Azula's locked up too. If he just told him the truth right away, the arc wouldn't have happened. I mean, the whole reason he lied about who he was to avoid being mobbed. But he's not going to be mobbed in someone's house, so there's no point to keeping the lie up at that point. Eventually, Katara waterbends to protect Misu, who refuses to leave the forest. This means there's enough time for her brother to lose his mask, causing Aang to find out that her brother was the victim of Ko, and offhandedly mention that he's met Ko, the face stealer, causing the spirit to admit that's her son. The woman could have easily told the heroes right away that he lost his face. She had no reason to lie to the Avatar that his face was disfigured instead of taken. If she gave him this info, he could have said he met Ko the second the spirit felt like leaving. And we'd lose a ton of the padding that thinks is exciting. Aang could have taken off his mask in front of the spirit immediately. Aang finds out that Ko's been stealing faces for all of history because he misses his estranged mother so much. So all the face stealing is her fault for being too selfish and irresponsible to reunite with him. And Ko's a jerk, so he deserves to be characterized like this. And for someone as arbitrary as him, I'm glad he's fleshed out a little. Aang says the Avatar spared Ko despite what he did to his girlfriend. I guess Aang's saying this to make the spirit like him, because he should know that spirits are immune to bending, so of course he didn't kill Ko. The spirit puts her hand on the guy's head, and returns his face and personality, Aang thanks the spirit and says that he needed her help to restore two relationships, one between a mother and her son. It's smart of him to say this to try to encourage her to help, by comparing it to her own estranged relationship. It turns out reality ensued because Norrin immediately recognized Zuko from his scar, and yet nobody recognized his scar in all the time he was wandering the Earth Kingdom going by the name Lee. So while I thought people should recognize the scar right after he disguised himself, it's because of the show that I dismissed that. Ursa didn't even know she had a different name before. I have to assume that when she wondered why she got amnesia, he said, "You tripped and hit your head." Eventually, when he says he's Ekim and Zuko says he belongs here with his father, Ekim says he couldn't be his father. Eventually, Azula bursts through the roof and sends Zuko away with fire, and the story conveniently pretends fire is a solid object. Azula takes it personally that her mother had a new kid when she was gone, which makes Proto Man and Archie comparable to Azula here. So maybe it makes sense that some people hated Flynn using the fan theory that he was just a jealous child, because that's how bad it makes him look. A boomerang hits Azula in the head, and this is sort of satisfying because she kept underestimating it, but it misses the point by not showing the impact. Azula's not knocked out by this though. A later comic will have someone get knocked out by this. Azula threatens her mother, who says she's sorry she didn't love her enough if she's right about her accusations. I'm glad she got to say this to her, so there is something of substance to come out of Azula seeing her mother, even if it was too forgettable. She tears up, and Zuko grabs her arm, so I guess he didn't see her tears, or he didn't think that would cause her to change her mind. And she sends fire at him, which could be just out of spite for grabbing her. He tells Azula he can redirect her lightning anywhere. Somehow she grabs the idiot ball and tries using lightning on him anyways, so she gets hit with it. She tries to talk some sense into Zuko at long last, saying that if she gets what she wants, he'll be free of a throne he never wanted, and she'll be free of the nagging in her head. But why would he be free of that because she got rid of her? It's like how Surge thinks she'd stop being miserable if she got rid of Sonic, even though she hallucinated someone else despite being separated from him. Azula wants Zuko to admit that he needs her to be free. He admits that he always knew the throne was his destiny, and that she's still his sister. She gets upset and can't handle hearing that for some reason, even though she's not able to feel guilty, and runs away. Her tearing up earlier would make sense if she felt guilty, but if that was the case, she wouldn't be able to throw lightning at Zuko, so she's pretty confusing. Her family follows her and finds the spirit, who is conveniently nice enough to come here even though she made a big hissy fit out of the idea of being expected to grant 2 favors. Again, makes sense because she's trying to repair a relationship with a mother and her son. Considering that she was offended at the idea of someone asking her for a new face because she's responsible for people's faces, it makes sense that she would jump at the chance to return someone's face to the way she originally made it because she prefers that original face. She agrees to get her memories back, and Aang thinks Azula dropped the letter for Zuko on purpose. While this is surprising because Azula is evil, you really would have to drop a letter on purpose. Katara kisses his cheek and says the reason she loves him is his optimism. Eventually, Ursa apologizes to Zuko for not loving him enough, lampshading, "What kind of mother forgets her son?" He reassures her and she calls him handsome and shows him respect. He gives her a letter and gets told that she had lied. The story could have easily shown us this much earlier. It already had tension after all. Ozai already knew Zuko was his real son because he had spies track her every move for months before they were married. I assume he means for 10 months. Otherwise, this means nothing. She says that she only lied in her letter because she wanted to see if he was reading her letters and hurt him, and wishes that Ekim really was Zuko's dad. Why'd she say maybe? Why did she make more than one letter if she knew they weren't being mailed? She gets told that every time he abuses them, he'll just be fulfilling his mother's wish. Ursa says there's so much she wants to tell her son, and he tells her he wants to hear all of it. This slow-paced but interesting arc by Jean Yang was about Zuko finally tracking down his mother because of the letters she wrote to her ex-boyfriend she could have easily not had, even though she knew that they weren't being mailed after the first few times. So it was lucky that Azula even knew about them so that she could start this arc. And he finds her in the first issue. But her new husband doesn't simply give Zuko the necessary information right away, because for no reason he thought Ursa would be taken away from him if he did, when Zuko showed no sign of being like that. A better excuse for keeping the secret would be that he was worried she would be mad at him for keeping a huge secret about her from her for years. He even kept her real name from her. That sounds familiar. But she doesn't care because they're in love. If Katara can be insecure and paranoid that her boyfriend would leave her for fangirls, it'd be just as believable for him to think Ursa would leave him if he told the truth right away. And I can assume that he didn't explain this because he didn't want to get the idea in her head and get her turned on him when she wouldn't have been otherwise. So it still makes sense that the arc happened. What's controversial about the arc is that Ursa gave up her memories of her kids to feel better, even though she lampshaded herself twice, because it's not what fans expected and makes her look bad. She's thoroughly sympathetic in nearly every other way though. And I forgive it because while it is an excuse to make money off 2 more issues than they needed to have, it was worth it because it made life easier on Ursa. She hated remembering that because she couldn't be with them. So it's mean to her to think she should have been suffering. I'd gladly take something being less depressing. Being mad at her would make sense if it weren't for the spirit conveniently deciding to return her memories in face so she wouldn't have to keep living with the consequence of her decision. Despite her tantrum being expected to help someone more than once. Why'd she help anyone if she's the type to only want to help once a season? You'd think she would want to help more than just one person a season then. It's not like it's too complicated to understand, so it's not literally convoluted. It makes sense that they add more stuff to it than they had to, because they really did have to, because it would have been a pretty boring story if literally all it was about was Ursa did get found by the search parties. Then Zuko himself wouldn't have had to go search for her, so there wouldn't have really been an interesting plot there. It makes sense that they made a whole arc of that, because a story that boring isn't really what people would want. And nobody would want to feel like him finding his mother was just an afterthought. Appa can fly really fast, so it's not enough for her to be really far away from him. It would have been pretty boring to have a whole story arc about just Appa flying ahead. A lot of the story was taken up by padding because of the spirit throwing a tantrum, which could have easily been avoided because the waterbender had no excuse to not explain that her brother lost his face, because then the spirit would have been told about that right away. And in general, the arc was slower paced than it should be because of this padding. It's good compared to the last arc. In terms of the plot events though, it's forgettable, because there were only a few things that were memorable before I came back to this to review it. What Ursa did to herself, and the fact that Spirit's throwing a tantrum for some of it. Almost none of the flashbacks are a waste of time, so that's a miracle. But it's ironic that in a story arc about Zuko searching for his mother, the actual searching for his mother is done in one issue. I love that there was a happy ending for that waterbender and Zuko, and that Azula willingly decided to leave her mother alone from now on. The fact that she chose to run away and apparently didn't return to try to fight her again is nice by Azula standards. But for all I know, it'll be established that she was planning to return and Ursa moved after this. So we never know if she was actually planning to return to kill her. If she didn't move, then we would actually know for sure that she did change her mind. Unlike an episode of the show, this really didn't have much happen in it. So it's a bit thankful to see conflict from Azula and the waterbender because it made for visually interesting panels. But they still didn't matter to the plot, just happening to stretch things out and look cool. So I still felt impatient with them and skimmed through their dialogue because nothing that happened besides what ended and started the conflict mattered enough for me to mention. But it was entertaining and never had lasting consequences, so it's worth it.